Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Publics at IIHS. This is a platform where we invite scholars and practitioners to come and talk about their research. And we are very happy to have Richa Kumar here with us today. Richa is Associate Professor of Sociology and Policy Studies at IIT Delhi and here to speak about her research. So welcome, Richa. We are really excited to hear you speak. We're also joined by Pratigna Punacha Kodera, who is faculty here at IIHS. She's also part of the climate change team here, and she'll be moderating today's session. So thanks, Pratigna, for agreeing to do this. Before we start, so Richa is going to take about 40 minutes to talk, and we'll then open it up to Q&A. If you have questions and comments, please drop them in the Q&A box, and we will pick them up towards the end of the session. We're also live on Facebook, so if you're watching us there, please drop your comments, and we will pick them up there. So thanks, everybody. Over to you, Pratigna.
Thank you, Tanvi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Publics at IIHS this evening. I'm very excited to be talking to Dr. Richa Kumar, as Tanvi said. Richa is the Associate Professor of Sociology and Policy Studies at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. So welcome, Richa, to this talk. And she also holds a position as Associate Faculty, School of Public Policy, IIT Delhi. Her research and teaching interests are in the sociology of agriculture, food and nutrition, science and technology studies, and rural and agrarian policy. She is a co-author of the State of Rural and Agrarian India Report 2020. And her current research is on the impact of monoculture farming on farming systems, the environment, and human health. Her book, Rethinking Revolutions, Soybean, Chopals, and the Changing Countryside in Central India was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. She is a recipient of the inaugural Elizabeth Adiseshaya Memorial Award in 2019, the New India Fellowship 2010, and is a member of the Network of Rural and Agrarian Studies. She completed her PhD from the Science, Technology, and Society program at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge, USA. A very warm welcome to you. We are privileged to have you with us and speak to us about what we eat and what we value, re-embedding markets in ecology. So that's what talking to us about. A little bit about the talk itself. Let me introduce the talk and then Richa, you can speak more about it. Social scientists have written a great deal about the social embeddedness of markets. In this talk, Richa will be drawing attention to the ecological embeddedness of markets, about the materials economy that we live in and live off, the markets that we have created, especially for agriculture and our food systems, exist outside of the ecology, outside of nature. They work on the principle that nature itself, by itself, has no value and has no limits. And they have facilitated a materials economy that is destroying our planet along with our health. In this talk, Richa will argue that healing ourselves and our planet requires us to re-embed our understanding of the markets within ecology. And this, especially in the context of global environmental change, climate change, and systemic shocks like the current COVID-19 pandemic that we are in, questions of what we value and how we attach value to what we value becomes very important. So I'm very excited to hear more about what you have to say, Richa, this evening. Tanvi has already introduced some of the housekeeping comments and rules. So the format is that we'll follow, we'll have Richa to speak to us for about 45 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open to questions to the audience. So audience, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and we'll pick it up after the discussion. So without taking any more of your time, Richa, I open the floor to you. So please.
Thank you so much, Pratigna, and thank you, Tanvi. And it's a pleasure to be back at IIHS. I remember coming to IIHS about 2 years ago, and you have a beautiful campus. It's a pleasure to actually be there and have the opportunity to even work there. So it's very nice to be back in very nice, warm company. And I look forward to speaking to you today about my topic, as Pratigna said, what we eat and what we value. So before I sort of begin, let me very briefly say what I mean by the ecological embeddedness of markets. When I say that, it sort of seems obvious, but let me sort of lay it out for you. What exactly do I mean here? There are two things that I wish to speak to you about when I speak about the embeddedness of markets in ecology. The first is about externalities, and that I'm sure many of you are familiar with here. And I'll briefly get into that. And the second is about standardization, and I think that is something that people here may not be very familiar with, and that's drawing upon my own work related to food and nutrition in the realm of agricultural markets and food. And that's what I will try and focus on. But before that, before I get into the description of these two ideas, let me just very briefly lay out to you what exactly are markets. I mean, what is the purpose of markets? Effectively, they are meant to facilitate exchange, and markets are as old as, in some ways, human civilization. How do they actually work? Again, in very simple terms, markets work because somebody, in of course today's day and age, it's the state or the government, or in it can be many other entities. Somebody makes the rules and regulations about how exchange is supposed to take place, and people who participate in those markets, they follow those rules. So contracts work because they are enforced, of course, in modern times by the law. And what this really means is that markets don't exist in abstraction. There is no automatic coming together of demand and supply. They are embedded in society very, very clearly. And this, of course, means that some people get to make the rules. And also some people get to flout the rules. They don't necessarily have to follow the rules all the time. And so power matters in the setting of the terms of exchange. This is, of course, the social embeddedness of markets. And while I don't wish to dwell on it today, but if people are interested in the Q&A, I can certainly talk about it, is the farm protest that we've been seeing. I certainly want to at least mention it briefly here. The farm protest that we've been seeing since, the middle of last year in Punjab and then around Delhi, starting in November, exemplified this fact of the social embeddedness of markets. They've been talking about the inequity of market power, the danger of oligopolies and monopolies, the problem with lack of regulation. When there are no rules, then how does one in fact have any kind of accountability? How is there any kind of transparency, price signaling? There is a whole host of different functions that are there in terms of the rules and regulations associated with markets. And I'm very happy to take questions on this later on. But drawing from this, what I wish to again speak to you about today is how markets are also embedded in ecology. And let me begin by actually giving an example to you. And an example which will make the idea of externalities very, very clear. Simple example, and this is actually about the Japanese. So in Japan, and in Tokyo, Japan, there is this fish market known as the Tsukiji fish market, one of the most famous fish markets around the world. And as you guys may be aware, the Japanese love their fish, their seafood, and fish from around the world finds its way to the Tsukiji fish market. It is auctioned there, and from there, then it moves along long supply chains, not only within Japan, but in many other parts of the world. And what we have seen over time, and this is something anybody working with fisheries would be very clearly aware, that the existence of long supply chains, as I call them, in food and agricultural markets has facilitated the extraction of resources from nature to an extent where those resources now are endangered in nature. So the whale is supposed to be a huge delicacy in Japan, and the Japanese have been consuming whales from as far down as the Antarctic Ocean. So they have these trawlers moving around all over the Pacific and of course in the southern Atlantic Ocean also. And we have overfished clearly these whales. And yet there is still demand for this exotic delicacy now in a country like Japan, because there are people, fairly rich people in that country, who are willing to pay any kind of price to get access to this particular resource. So this explains in some ways very nicely the concept of externalities, that the whale has value only once it's on the plate of the Japanese, or once it has been auctioned at the Tsukiji fish market. Before that, the whale in the ocean itself has no value. We don't have a way to capture that value. Now, economists, of course, and I'm sure there'll be lots of economists here who have thought about these questions very, very deeply, and they have come up with various kinds of ways to attribute value to different things in nature. So ecotourism, for example, is a way to attribute value to the whales in the ocean or the dolphins in the ocean, where there are different kinds of mechanisms that are created where you pay to go and see the dolphins in the ocean or the whales, or there's a whale watch and all kinds of other things. So that's a different way to create value for something which is a natural resource which may have other users, but now you're creating a different kind of use for the resource and attributing value to it. Except that what's very clear in all of this is that the whale has value only when it is seen through our lenses. So there is no intrinsic value to that whale while it's in the ocean. The value is only because it is in some senses related to our consumption. I'll give you another example. This is about bauxite. So it's not in the realm necessarily of food and agriculture, but it also is a very interesting example to think about. So bauxite is what is mined in eastern India, in the forests of Orissa and Jharkhand. And bauxite is the raw material through which we obtain aluminium, which is one of the most important metals that is known to man, to humankind, and is used in a whole host of applications. And bauxite is typically found in flat-topped hills, which are actually very, very green. I mean, those areas are hotspots of biodiversity. Now, again, the bauxite only gains value once it is extracted and introduced into a marketing system, into a market economy. When the bauxite is underground, it has no value. So we, in the sense of, can you guys hear me? I'm sorry, it's saying my internet connection is unstable. So in case you lose me, just let me know.
We can hear you, Richa.
Okay, great. So there is no mechanism that we have in terms of the way we attribute value in markets to the bauxite being under the ground. Yet, when the bauxite is under the ground, its water retention capacity is what is absolutely critical to maintaining the biodiversity of that mountain ecosystem. The minute you take the bauxite out of the ground, that entire ecosystem collapses because there is no other mechanism for water to be retained inside the soil, within the mountain, within the rocks. And yet, unfortunately, we again have no way of attributing value to that very life-giving characteristic of bauxite. So until now, this must be fairly clear. Economists use the term externalities to talk about this. That in our calculations, for example, for our gross domestic product, in terms of our calculations for our incomes and welfare, there is no way to account for these other services, which of course today nowadays are known as ecosystem services. So that's another way of trying to figure out how to attribute value to some of these things I described. But there is very clear that our current systems of measurement and of attribution of value don't take into account these externalities. But what is the second bit in terms of the ecological embeddedness of markets? So in terms of externalities, the minute we realize that actually embedded in ecology, in nature, that is finite, that has limits, then we need to begin to take that into account in our calculations of value. But the other bit that I want to talk to you guys about is this idea of standardization. Now, this is something that seems a bit counterintuitive. And the reason it seems counterintuitive is because on the one hand, what we have seen over the last, let's say about 100 years or so, possibly slightly longer than that. In the case of the United States, maybe about 150 years or so. What we have seen over time is the development of markets that are characterized by very long supply chains. So the Japanese whale example is a classical example of that. The fact that the Japanese can consume a whale that has been shipped off the coast of Chile in South America is an example of a very long supply chain. There are technologies of refrigeration, technologies of fishing, technologies of a whole variety of kinds to enable that whale to be brought to the plate of a consumer in a restaurant in Tokyo or elsewhere. But what this has done is it's actually ended up creating a process of it's created what I call as a standardized food. And in the process of creating a standardized food, it has also created what I call a standardized consumer. So let me explain this. So the reason I say this is counterintuitive is because on the one hand, we have sort of been led to believe, or we feel that in comparison to say 50 years back, or in comparison to our grandparents' generation, we actually have a lot more choice, a lot more diversity when it comes to the food that we eat on our plate. That in the past, if it was the season for bhindi, then you would be eating bhindi every day because that's what the farm was giving you. Or if it was the season for gobi, then you would be eating gobi every day. And today, we can in fact get bhindi, which is lady's finger, all around the year, and you can get gobi, which is cauliflower, again, all around the year. And that's, of course, contributed to the diversity that we have. If you look at any modern supermarket or store, there is a dizzying array of a whole variety of food items that we can eat. In fact, today you can be in a supermarket in Bangalore or in Delhi and you can get foods from anywhere. I mean, you can get those imported avocados, you can get the kiwis from New Zealand. Of course, both those things are now being grown by farmers around Bangalore and in Maharashtra. But there are these long supply chains of exotic food also, which and long supply chains of ordinary foods like gobi and bhindi that we have come to take for granted. So in Delhi, for example, our cauliflower, as you guys might be aware, is actually a winter vegetable. And so grandparents would always say that, don't eat the cauliflower in the summer. It's not meant to be eaten in the summer. It's only meant to be eaten in the winter. But in the summer, Delhi gets its cauliflower first from Shimla and then actually from you guys. We get it from all the way from Bangalore. It's shipped to Azadpur Mandi and then it's distributed retail stores here and it comes into our homes. So this is a process that on the one hand, we feel that these long supply chains that have been built on increasingly the role of corporations in agriculture, private capital and corporations in agriculture, seem to have given the urban consumer a great deal of choice and diversity. Yet, if we actually look at the raw material in terms of the raw ingredients, in terms of what we eat, and compare that with what our grandparents ate in the past, it actually looks like the diversity on our plate has in fact narrowed down significantly. And while we may be eating 20 different foods, the raw materials underlying those 20 different foods are a handful. So let me give you an example. And this example is something that will be very intimately familiar to all of you, especially the young people here who've been consuming pizzas and burgers and cereal, possibly momos, cookies, biscuits, all of the stuff that we see in terms of our whole array of choices. All of these foods fundamentally are composed of 3 ingredients. The first ingredient is highly refined wheat flour, which is maida. The second ingredient is refined edible oil. And typically in the case of India is now palm oil or soybean oil, typically palm oil, refined palm oil. And the third ingredient in the case of India, it's of course white sugar. In the case of countries like the United States or Europe, it is high fructose corn syrup, which is from maize, makkah. where they wanted to replace their markets. They were dependent on the tropical world for sugarcane and sugar beet to produce their sugar. And they could grow corn in their own countries, which is maize, and they figured out ways to convert that corn into the sweetener, which is high fructose corn syrup. And so these three are the base ingredients of pretty much every single processed item that you will eat from a supermarket shelf. And nutrition research is now telling us over the last 10 to 15 years, in fact, probably a bit longer, the last 20 years or so, it's been telling us that all of these items are not only, well, it's not that they don't provide us much in terms of nutritive value, but worse, they are actually detrimental to our health. They do a great deal of damage to our health. So not only that we're not getting anything good out of them, we are in fact destroying our health bit by bit in the process of consuming these things. And I can explain a little bit more about why that is the case. Broadly, this is looking at we're mostly consuming highly polished cereals, refined edible oil. The processes of refining, they remove odor of a certain kind, they remove discoloration of a certain kind, but they actually destroy the nutritive value in those oils. So palm oil processed in the traditional way, it's a traditional oil of certain parts of West Africa. And processed in the traditional way, it has a very, so like mustard oil, right? Mustard oil has this fragrance, if you can say, or to some people, they just don't like it. It's too smelly. But that's part of the characteristic of that oil. Similarly, palm oil, when processed in localized ways, or without the use of machines that produce a great deal of heat and transform it to remove the color and odor, that palm oil is a very different entity altogether in terms of its nutritive and health impacts. But the minute you convert it and process it through this machinery, there is a different set of implications. Now, the question arises, why is it that we are consuming this so-called refined stuff? And why is it that we think because actually, before I embarked on all of this research on food and nutrition, I myself thought that refined edible oil is in fact a great thing to consume. All the advertisements that we have seen and we have heard, about good for your heart and a whole host of other things, right? They say that refined edible oil, it's been the sort of answer to the terrible effects of ghee in our country. And so a whole host of people, at least my generation and before, shifted very happily to refined edible oil. And so it's only once I started this research that I realized that the reason why many of these processes were done, the processing of many of these raw materials was done, was to make it pleasing to the customer. So this goes back to the basic point of standardization that I'm trying to make. And the point here is that as consumers, we have come to expect something that is of a certain kind of quality. So quality has been defined for us in very specific ways. And one of the important ways in which it has been defined is that it is the same no matter what. There is no variation. So if I want to go and buy a tomato, for example, then I want, or as a consumer, especially now, when you're looking at websites and you're buying food off the web, I look at a tomato and the picture of the tomato, no matter which website you will go to, which organic website or now any other website, Big Basket and all of those, you'll find that nice round red color tomato on the website. And when the tomato actually shows up, then we are also expecting these nice round red tomatoes to show up. So we've come to expect a certain kind of standardized quality, that every time I buy a tomato, this is what it should be. And if it doesn't quite look like that, then that's probably not very good quality. Without quite realizing that, first of all, nature doesn't produce standardized quality at all. I mean, there's nothing standardized in nature, because the minute nature standardizes something, it would mean that it would make it uniform. And the minute there is something uniform in nature, it is immediately susceptible to destruction. So nature thrives on variability, because the minute you have something uniform, if there is a single pest or a disease that attacks that particular crop or that particular animal, the whole thing is destroyed. The Irish potato famine is a very famous example of this. There was a single potato variety that was grown all across Ireland in the mid 1800s, and that was destroyed by the potato blight, which led to a lot of people, suffering because of that. I mean, of course, there were policies of the British colonial administration in not supporting people and in providing them with food. But the fundamental fact that they were growing a single variety and that was destroyed was the trigger for the distress and for the famine that followed. And so it's very clear in nature, monocultures or single varieties or single species of the same kind don't quite survive. And to make them survive, we as farmers and scientists and consumers have, have worked and created different processes of monoculture farming to ensure that a certain given variety of either a plant or an animal, in the case of factory farming of animals, we've tried to ensure that the best kind of animal with the largest amount of meat on it, or the largest weight by kg, or in terms of plants, a certain size, shape of food, or a certain color or a texture. Those are the things that we have. So basically, in terms of appearance, or in terms of value for money, in terms of what the consumer may want, or in terms of something that will stay longer. So the characteristic of also perishability, we want to reduce the perishability of things so that they can flow across these longer supply chains and reach consumers in far off places. All of those qualities have been pursued by scientists. In the case of the tomato, there's a very interesting book, if anybody's interested, called Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times, which talks about the enormous amount of research money that was spent in the United States to develop a tomato that was absolutely hard on the outside. But when you cut it, it was still soft enough to be giving the right texture and consistency for people when they ate it as part of their salad. And you needed it hard because you needed to be doing the growing and harvesting by machines. You wanted to replace labor. So there were a whole variety of different kinds of goals that were bred into the food system and into different crops, plants and animals, to facilitate a certain kind of long supply chain, to facilitate through science and through the investment of capital, the creation of a certain kind of product, a certain product that appealed to a consumer in a particular way. And that appeal was presented to the consumer in terms of standardization and good quality. And to produce that standardized good quality time and again, year after year, farmers were made to engage in this sort of battle with nature, that you have to grow this monoculture, this particular standardized variety, and you have to use as many chemicals as you can, because without chemicals, there will be infection, there will be disease, there will be pests that will attack that particular monoculture. And through the use of chemicals, you can somehow manage to save your crop. And that will then feed into this long standardized supply chain to the consumer. And as consumers, on the other hand, we have then been conditioned to believe that this standardized product that we are getting is actually of good quality. It is good for us. It's good for our health. It's what we should get to expect. And any of those green tomatoes, the tera mera tomatoes, the small sized tomatoes, slightly orange ones, the little squishy ones, we really don't, or the very, very hard ones, we don't want any of them at all. Now, why is this a problem? This is a problem because on the farm, when you're growing monocultures, you are actually engaging in a losing battle. Because over time, your crop starts getting, the pests start getting resistant to the pesticides that you're growing. Your seeds are not viable anymore. You keep needing newer and newer seed varieties that will withstand pest and disease attacks. Which is why we have a huge scientific establishment in agriculture that is providing this kind of support and service to farmers. On the other hand, the costs of farming keep going up because you need more and more heavier doses of pesticides, because now the pests have become pesticide resistant. And eventually what you're doing is producing toxicity in the soil, in the water, toxicity in the food, toxicity in people's bodies, farmers' own bodies. And so there is a huge cost that we are paying for producing these monoculture products on the farm. And if you come to animals, all of us in the last year, and now again, given the rising number of cases, are paying the cost in terms of these influenza viruses. So there's a great deal of work that's showing how factory farming, so animals that are not necessarily clones of each other, but genetically very, very similar. So if you find one particular bull or one particular chicken, that seems to be, chickens are bred to be larger and from a single genetic source, or the same bull is used to inseminate a whole host of other animals to ensure a certain kind of cow which provides a certain amount of milk or a certain kind of meat is then produced, and this is factory farms in the United States, factory farms in the Middle East, factory farms in Europe, and also increasingly factory farms in India, Southeast Asia, China. And each of these factory farms around the world has been linked to a whole host of influenza viruses, because again, you have genetically similar animals in closed, cramped conditions needing antibiotics all the time to ensure that disease doesn't spread. And those are the perfect conditions for what is known as zoonosis, where viruses that are affecting animals then jump the species barrier and they start affecting human beings. And anybody here from Kerala would remember the Nipah virus, which actually came from pig factory farms in Malaysia. And of course, COVID-19, we're not quite sure of what really are the origins. There are still debates, but there is some suggestion that perhaps it's pig factory farms also in China, in Wuhan, which is the 5th largest producer of pigs, slaughter pigs in China, where there is some possibility of there. But of course, none of this has been verified due to reasons that I'm sure you guys quite understand quite well. So anyway, on the farm side, there are these serious problems in terms of the toxicity of the land, the environment, and ourselves and farmers, and the food that we eat, and in terms of the health impacts of these viruses that are jumping the species barrier. But on the other hand, the consumers, why is it, why do we need to eat those green, sarawa, misshapen tomatoes? Why is it that we cannot just eat the nice, round, juicy tomatoes the way that we've been made to expect? Well, the answer to that actually lies in history in some senses, that if you go back and look at culinary recipes across different parts of the country, it turns out that there were different uses for the different kind of varieties that people found in nature. So there was a certain kind of tomato that was useful for rasam. There was a certain kind of tomato that would be good to make chutney. There was a certain kind of tomato that would be fine for the table salad. And each of those had a certain use. Or if we take varieties of rice, it would be nice if we could actually have some show of hands, although I'm not sure if it's possible in this. But, given that you guys are in Bangalore, I wonder how many of you consume primarily basmati rice, which is, a rice that is now the heartland of Punjab. And Punjab has, of course, been growing so much of this basmati, exporting its groundwater in the process of growing this basmati and exporting it. But in the United States or in other parts of the world, Indian rice is only basmati rice. There is no other rice that people even are aware of. And this does serious injustice to the whole. We had more than 70,000 land races of rice in our country. Now we are growing a handful of them, like barely a handful. And the knowledge as well as the varieties that existed in the past are gone. Apart from the fact that this is, of course, detrimental in terms of climate change. And if we don't have those varieties and that knowledge of how to grow them, we are going to be more and more reliant on very, very few cultivars for our entire food supply. And if something happens to these because of the process of monoculture agriculture, we won't have anywhere else to turn to except for these, seeds of these gene banks. But the knowledge of how to grow those seeds and whether those seeds in those gene banks are even viable is actually not clear to us anymore. We've sort of left our fate to the hands of the scientists, but the farmers who in fact had the knowledge of growing those seeds in different variable conditions, that particular knowledge has been lost. But what is happening as a process is that, like I mentioned earlier, that all the processed food that we eat is based on these three raw materials, raw ingredients. Similarly, what we are actually eating is a shadow of what people ate in the past. Now, I know this again seems very, very counterintuitive, but let me just take the simple example of bringing sourness into our food. So whereas in the past, we brought the taste of khatta or sour through at least 5 or 6 different things. We had tamarind, we had tomatoes, we had lemons, we had narangi, which is a different kind of small sized orange. We had kokum, we had dried mango powder, amchur. In today's kitchen, we will be hard pressed to find all of those. And of course, it would vary by geography and vary by season, because not each of these will be available every season. But today, the tomatoes and the lemons are the ones that are available year round, despite the fact that neither tomatoes nor lemons are really suited to be growing all year round. It's just that they grow in different climatic conditions, and then we get our stuff from elsewhere. Sitting in Delhi, and I'm sure people in Bangalore must be getting their foods from different parts. I mean, the apples, right? So you would be consuming apples in the summer because those are cold storage apples coming either from Himachal, or they are imported apples coming possibly from China or elsewhere. So again, these are long supply chains which are making consumers consume foods that are, one, less diverse, two, off season. So we are consuming foods outside of the natural cycle of how they were originally grown and consumed. And in the process, what we are doing is compromising our immunity, compromising our health. So what these standardized foods are creating is a set of standardized consumers. And that is something that is absolutely disastrous, because what we are seeing, again, the COVID example is an excellent example, because the same sets of processes that are creating these standardized foods are the ones that are creating these compromised consumers. And in either case, I mean, we are losing our immunity. And so we are turning to, I don't know how many of you will recall in the last 1 year, all of the calls to have more giloy, to have more ashwagandha, to have a whole variety of, these herbal remedies, many of which are now being grown on monoculture farms across the country. And so even our solution for compromised health is actually more monoculture farming and more monoculture processes and longer supply chains. So many of the herbs, in fact, are coming from the Himalayas, which are now slowly being decimated of their trees and of their biodiversity. Also, mountains in central India. All of these places are now feeling the effects of the kind of long supply chain consumption that we as consumers in urban metropolitan centers have been doing. So
Richa, I'm just doing I'm just doing a time check for you.
Yes, I understand. Thanks.
Yeah.
So the question then becomes, how do we actually get out of this? Where do we go from here? And the answer, as I have mentioned in my abstract, is the 3 Ds. The first is degrowth. And perhaps many of you here will be familiar with that idea, and I'll briefly talk about it. The second is diversity. How do we bring back the diversity in our supply chain? And the third is decentralization. How do we create markets that will facilitate degrowth, diversity, and decentralization? And that's how I will wrap up my talk. So the idea of degrowth, I'm assuming some of you here would be familiar with it, is specifically targeting the reduction of the size of the materials economy. So the fact that there are limits in nature, we recognize those limits, we learn to work with those limits, and we only consume or extract what is absolutely necessary for ourselves. And of course, there's a great deal of debate and discussion on how do you define what is necessary. And of course, the concept of degrowth has been more and more prominent in the case of climate change, and how do we transform our patterns of consumption to mitigate climate change. And that leads to the second aspect of degrowth, which is redistribution. So the idea is not only do we redefine what are our needs to reduce the size of the materials economy, we in fact redistribute wealth. And there are some, horrifying statistics that tell us about the levels of inequality in the world and in India. So it turns out about 1% of our population owns 50% of the wealth of our country. Now that's a mind-boggling statistic, where if you even take half of that and redistribute it across, everybody else, we can do a great deal in terms of fulfilling the needs of a great number of people in our country. And so then the third aspect of degrowth is, how do we rework our value system? That is what comes, the bit of my talk which says what we eat and what we value. How do we reframe value? So if we go back to my earlier examples, when I spoke about externalities and when I spoke about standardized foods and compromised consumers, our food system is very often defended by arguing that it provides us, one, very cheap food, and two, it's very efficient. So it's producing a great deal of volume of food or quantity of food in very little cost. Except that very process of calculation of efficiency has no way to account for the negative nutritional implications of that food system. And so I'll throw another statistic at you guys, and this one is even more surprising and even more horrific. I think when I heard of it, I just couldn't even believe it. But this is the Center for Disease Control in the United States, 2015-2016 data, which tells us that 7 out of 10 Americans over the age of 20, this is 70% of adult Americans, are overweight or obese. That is, their BMI is more than 25.2. Now, that is a mind-boggling statistic. And a great deal of the consequence of this, this kind of health outcome, there have been many different causal factors for it. But one of the important causal factors has been the shift in diets and the concentration of diets along highly carbohydrate heavy, sugar heavy diets of Americans. Very little diversity in terms of the food they are in fact consuming. And of course, these long supply chains that are supplying them, also creating what is known as the concept of food deserts. So low-income people in many communities in the United States don't get to consume fruits and vegetables at all, because those supply chains to those communities don't even exist. So we've calculated efficiency only using the yardstick of cheapness and only looking at the yardstick of what may be suiting capital or what may be suiting the needs of the state in terms of how it is defining food security, in terms of a quantitative number. But we haven't at all been able to account for the whole health linkages, nutritional linkages of this food system and the implications. So what would it take to then bring that into the accounting of value and into the framing of value? And so this is what is the third aspect of degrowth, which is reworking our value systems to prioritize care and well-being defined in multiple ways over wealth or efficiency decided by cost alone. The other 2 points, the first one on diversity, is about figuring out ways to restructure markets to facilitate more diverse practices on the farm. So have farmers grow a whole host of different kinds of foods according to season and geography, according to agroecology, which would of course require us to revalue the knowledge that exists in the minds and in the practices of farmers, and also would require scientists to work with farm communities to figure out ways in which cropping patterns can be changed. But more importantly, this will require us to change. It will require us as consumers to begin to revalue our health over convenience, begin to revalue our health over certain kinds of aspirational consumption that we've been made to believe, begin to revalue what we understand as good quality, begin to revalue the variability that we see in nature. So when we create the demand for diverse foods around our local vicinity, that is when we can actually create localized supply chains, create the demand and incentive for farmers to grow this. And of course, the state has a very, very important role to play in this. And some of the states in our country, including Karnataka and Telangana and Orissa, are already doing this. They are purchasing millets locally, and they're supplying that through the ICTS, the Anganwadi, the midday meal system, the public distribution system, which are very, very important ways of creating these localized supply chains or regional supply chains that, of course, have fewer food miles on them. So you are not having so many carbon emissions in terms of transportation, but you're also eating foods that are local, seasonal, and far more diverse. And so that's really the third bit about decentralization. How do we decentralize policy making such that we can facilitate the creation of markets that valorize degrowth, diversity, and decentralization? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Richa. It was really an absolutely enlightening and insightful talk. And one of the projects that I'm working on currently, which looks at urban and peri-urban agriculture in urban areas, we spoke to a lot of practitioners of urban agriculture. And most of them mentioned that one of the biggest motivators for them to sort of take up these urban gardening practices is the diversity, both in terms of food and nutritional diversity they are able to achieve through growing. But I'm quite aware that, the sample that we are talking to is quite a small number. And, it's also a very middle class or upper middle class phenomena as such who practice urban gardening or urban farming for nutritional and food diversity. And in the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that power matters, and that came up many times in the talk in various ways. So I'm just starting to think, how can we unpack this politics of power, be it the consumer and the grower, or even the policy context, or even the markets context? Is there a way that we can start unpacking this systematically and move towards a more, possibly a solution-oriented space?
So that's absolutely right. What you said, that the urban gardeners. I would also add to that, the organic food enthusiasts that we have in our country. Now there's a growing number, and I would say these are all actually wonderful ideas. Wonderful. I wouldn't like to call them experiments. I think they are wonderful practices that people are trying in their own communities to transform their own lives. Yet the concern that this brings up is that, like you said, these are very, very tiny, in some ways, if I may call them elite practices. Organic food, for example, in our country, or even millets. If you want to buy millets in our country in urban areas, well, they're very, very expensive. So the idea is that there is this sort of very historical way this has been framed, right? If you again go back to our Green Revolution, one of the ways the Green Revolution has been justified is that, people were hungry, starving, and dying. And so at that point of time, you need to give them food. It doesn't matter that, whether they're getting their vitamins or minerals, they're dying. So at least, now they're alive and, they're not, you need to take care of them in that way. Except that what has been seen now, there's a huge amount of revisionist literature and work that has come about to tell us that, no, frankly, we weren't actually dying and starving in the 1960s the way it's been made out to be. There were other kinds of geopolitical considerations at work. There were certain mindsets about what it means to be developed, certain mindsets about how funding and financial allocations need to be done, which created certain conditions where we ended up with this whole ship-to-mouth existence and had to rely on the United States. And then when the United States sort of pulled its hands away from us, from supporting us, we ended up creating conditions for what was known as the Green Revolution. But what we did in the process of the Green Revolution was, in fact, overload our farms and our plates with rice and wheat. And we've basically stopped, at least as of 5 years back, there was hardly any cultivation of millets that was going on. You wouldn't be able to go to a field, even in rural areas, and find anybody growing millets, barring in a handful of places, Karnataka being one of those exceptions. And one needs to unpack this history to be able to understand the politics of the present. Because very often the ideas and the policies of the present are justified in terms of the past. So there is this very productivist narrative of agriculture and food that is highly prevalent, which basically says that we are 9 billion people, or we will be 9 billion people in 2050, and we need to feed everybody. We need to have enough quantity of food. Yet that particular narrative comes from a certain kind of a framing. There is a certain politics of that narrative that needs to be understood, and a certain reliance on a particular vision or a particular narrow understanding of the past, which then allows us to justify more monoculture practices, justify things like genetically modified foods, which have not actually ended up supporting either health outcomes or nutrition outcomes, or even yield outcomes. What they have ended up supporting is broadly uh, more use of pesticides and more use of chemicals on the farm, even though ostensibly they're meant not to do that. So there is that politics which does need to be unpacked. You're absolutely right in saying that. But in the process of doing that, coming back to the point of the elite farmer or the elite consumer and the whole organic framing that we have, what will it take for us to reframe food security as the right to diverse, healthy, nutritious food for everybody? Today the idea is that if you're poor, then you should not be aspiring to organic or to healthy. You should just be fixing your life, whatever it is. And that is again about what we value in our own heads. How do we reframe our own value and thinking in terms of safe, healthy, nutritious, diverse food is a fundamental right for everybody. It doesn't matter what their poverty status is, or their caste is, or their any other attribute that they may have.
Yeah, absolutely. For the audience, I know there are a bunch of questions coming up. So all of you, please feel free to put in your questions in the question and answer box or the chat box, and we'll pick it up. And I have just one more question before I really open it to the audience. So, I mean, historically, you did mention a little bit of this in your previous response. Technology has played a huge role in sort of actually narrowing down our food and nutritional diversity, if we were to think back of it in that way. And now is the age of technology, and there's so many technological advances that's happening, both information technology as well as otherwise. Do you think we can again harness the power of technology to sort of move in the direction that you mentioned of degrowth, decentralization, diversity? What is the role of technology in that?
That's a very good question, because most often, when I speak about these issues, people automatically, slot this as anti-technology. That there is, we want to go back to the land, or go back to the older ways of doing things. And I'll just give you the example of millets to illustrate this. So millets, ragi or kodo, kutki, kangni, all of these millets. If anybody has seen them, they're really, really tiny. The grains of rice and wheat are larger, and the grains of these millets are actually much, much smaller. If you guys are familiar with mustard seeds, they're almost the size of mustard seeds, many of them. And in the past, when millets were grown and processed, they were hand pounded, just like, rice and wheat were. And hand pounding of those millets would remove the outer coating, the shell of those millets, just enough without actually destroying the nutritional content of that millet. Now, what we have with technology is that when you use technologies to process millets, so you use either the rice milling technology or something else, which will remove the outer shell. Unfortunately, we are doing with the millets what is being done with the wheat and the rice. We are polishing and polishing and polishing and taking out all the fiber and all the good stuff in it, and leaving very little in terms of the actual thing that we eat as consumers. And so then the question arises, okay, processing technology is not really doing the job it's supposed to be doing. Should we go back to hand pounding? And if you go back and listen to the stories of those women hand pounding those millets, that was back-breaking drudgery in terms of, the human effort involved. Women would have to get up at 4 in the morning to be doing this, to be preparing the meals for the day. No woman in her right mind will want to go back to that. I mean, women in the village or elsewhere, I mean, that electric chakki or the electric mixer grinder or any of these technologies have really been a boon. I mean, of course, you make chutney in the mixer and you make chutney on that silbatta that you do. The taste is drastically different, certainly. Yet the backbreaking drudgery and that labor needs to be recognized. And not only that, the gendered nature of that labor needs to be recognized, because it wasn't men who were doing it. It was women's work, very clearly. And so that then really leaves us with a very fundamental question: what is the role of technology here? And is it possible for us to reimagine processing technologies such that you can in fact retain the fiber in the millet? Now, what it turns out, again, just to finish the example of millets, it is possible to create machines. And there is a colleague of mine who's in fact working in this area, and he and his friends and colleagues have developed several machines that are quite suitable for the purpose. It's just that those machines have to be calibrated and recalibrated depending on the batch of seeds that you get. So given that there is, like I said, huge amount of variation and diversity in nature, so any crop of millet, any bag of seeds will have variation in terms of size. So the machines require a few extra steps in terms of processing to retain the nutritive value. Now, this will work if you are setting up localized processing units that will employ enough labor and enough systems to ensure those multiple processes take place. If you want to be a Reliance or an ITC and you want to process these millets at a scale of million tons or something, then you need those large factories, those large standardized machines, and you only need millet seeds of a certain size. And that is not possible with millets. That just doesn't. So when we say what is the role of technology, what we also need to ask along with it is, what are the kind of institutional mechanisms that we need to also create and support for that technology to be useful? So unless and until you think decentralized, this millet processing technology cannot actually take shape.
Thank you so much. There's so much to think about in what you have said. I'm going to stop now and open the floor for questions. There are a bunch of questions in the chat box here already, and I'm going to just read them out, Dr. Richa, for you. So the first question is, I am an architecture student doing a research on markets. My question to you is that in the changing world today, where on one hand, people have shifted to buying vegetables from online stores, and on the other hand, farmers protesting for the APMC markets to exist, what do you think is the future of the Sabzi Mandi in the coming 20 to 30 years?
A very interesting question and very important question today, because there is, of course, a great deal of interest in agri startups across India. And lots of startups and companies are trying to get into the space. And if we just stick to vegetables, it's an interesting history of the last 15 years, I think. About 15 years or so, when companies like Reliance Fresh or Mahindra also a bunch of companies, Tatas and all, tried to get into the space of fruit and vegetable retail. And in the beginning, there was this big whole agenda of disintermediation, which was that we'll get rid of these mandi intermediaries who are actually, shaving off so much money from the system. And, there are these corrupt intermediaries doing, all of these bad practices. And we will go straight to the farmer and we'll get the stuff that we need to get. And, fewer intermediaries, the farmer benefits, the consumer benefits, we benefit, it's good for everybody. Actually, 10 years down the line, most corporations and startups are actually buying their stuff from the mandi. So they have been unable to, in fact, go directly to the farm and purchase from there. And there are multiple reasons for that. One of the most important reasons is standardization of quality and lot size. So quality, I mean, you go to different farmers, they'll give you different kinds of stuff, but it's also in smaller lots. What you get at the mandi is, if you need a truck full of gobi, you'll get a truck full of gobi at the mandi. If you go to different farms, you may or may not get a truck full of gobi. And the expenditure involved, the costs involved in bypassing the mandi and going to the farm and doing all of the sorting, the quality grading, the aggregation is a lot more than one would in fact expect. And so what the other bit is that not only does the mandi or the mandi trader do this lot size, so reduction and increase in lot size in terms of quantity, and does some kind of quality distribution and evening out the quality. There are, of course, the economists would very clearly understand the interlinked markets here, that, there are relationships of credit between farmers and mandi intermediaries. And so mandi intermediaries are actually able to keep their margins fairly low, because they are making money not just from margins on price, they are making money through the interest on the loans that they're giving to farmers, and they are making money in terms of the rental income that they're getting from their shops in the mandi. So competing with mandi intermediaries is not quite as straightforward as it seems to be. And so frankly, I don't see those, especially in the fruit and vegetable markets, I don't see those intermediaries disappearing. It will be very, very hard for corporations to intervene, except that what the new farm laws have tried to do is create a space outside the mandi, which is an unregulated space, because there are no requirements for any kind of disclosure, or for transactions to be documented, or any of that kind of stuff. There are no mechanisms of accountability. If the laws do come back, what that will mean is that even mandi traders will then start purchasing outside the mandi. So it's not just that corporations will buy outside, but everybody will then go outside, because why do you want to buy in the mandi and pay all the taxes anyway? And that is what will then create the instability for the mandi system. And if we want, again, remember, when we're talking about the social embeddedness of markets, you need to have somebody enforcing rules, somebody enforcing those contracts, somebody ensuring accountability. And in an unregulated system outside, none of that exists, and that will cause immense amount of hardship and problems for farmers.
Thank you. So the next question is actually by a dear colleague of mine, Sheetal. And the question is, as the talk started with how we are aware about social embeddedness of markets, I wonder if there are integrated influences. Sorry, just give me a minute. I wonder if there are integrated influences of social and ecological forces when we think about food on our plate. Could I repeat the question, Richa?
Yeah, no, I also read it. So that's absolutely right, actually. In my talk, I highlighted the ecological embeddedness of markets because I wanted to make a certain point about externalities and standardization. But they are absolutely interlinked. When I spoke about the example of organic, the fact that ecology is being valorized and nutrition is being valorized, but for a very select class of people. And so it is absolutely essential for us to reconnect the social and the ecological. And the idea of degrowth, for example, does exactly that. It's talking about reducing the size of the materials economy, which is an ecological idea, but it's also talking about redistribution and redistribution, which is clearly a social idea, and then revaluing things differently, which is both social and ecological. So yes, certainly they are interlinked. They're absolutely intrinsically, and we must also treat them and understand them and work with them that way.
Thank you. So the next question is from A. Nandakumar, which I wonder if you can see this.
Yes, I'm just trying to read it.
Yeah. So let me read it out to the audience. The ready-made foods you mentioned that we consume generally in the marketplace, do they all have refined wheat, refined oil, which is, as you noted, usually palm oil, and refined sugar, which is fructose, in sufficient quantities and proportions so as to cause serious health problems? If so, are there any policy advisories from concerned institutions to remedy the same, and how are the governments across the world addressing the issue?
Okay, very, very good question. A very important question, because I must clarify here. So the concern is actually that if you look at the diets of children, for example, at the moment in our country, and if you look at rural children, for example, one of the most important items in their diet is biscuits. And biscuits are made of this. Biscuits have too much sugar, too much refined oil, and refined maida in it. If you are pretty much eating biscuits for at least 1 or 2 meals a day and not eating anything else, that can be detrimental to your health. Now, if you are the kind of person who is eating, pizza once a month or something, that means that your diet, in fact, has a whole host of other kinds of nutritive items, possibly diverse food items in it. Although even then, the increasing trend towards maida and even the flour that we eat, actually, even the atta that we buy from the roller flour mills, that atta also doesn't have the fiber in it, because the very mechanism, so this goes back to the question of processing technologies, the very mechanism of processing wheat to convert it into atta in a roller flour mill basically segregates the product into different kinds of products, with maida being one and atta being one and suji being another. But it also creates about, if I remember the numbers correctly, about I'm now forgetting my numbers, it's been a while, but between, I think, 10 to 20% or 20%, I think 1/5, that's right. 20% of the product is actually the bran, the fiber, which goes for cattle feed or which goes for other kinds of purposes. It doesn't go into the food end of the product. And so even the atta that we are eating doesn't have the nutritive value that it should have. If you go to the chakki, the electric chakki also, but where there is no sieving, no channa of the atta within the processing system, there the bran or the choker that comes out is between 6-7%. So a great deal of the stuff that should be going into our stomachs is actually going into cattle feed through these technologies. So there are two bits to this. One is the way the stuff has been processed, and second is the quantity of the stuff that we are eating. At one point of time, I think in 2015 or 16, biscuit manufacturers in our country were trying to convince the government that in your midday meal system, you give biscuits to children because that's such a healthy thing. I mean, again, the classical argument being it's efficient in terms of cost, and it is efficient in terms of kharab nahi hoga. It'll last very, very long. So this perishability question was very important. Except that biscuits are the worst kind of things we should have. Kids below 5 should not be eating biscuits at all. There's just nothing positive of nutritive value in it for children. So the question then really becomes, we have replaced all the nutritive things. I mean, highly polished wheat and rice have replaced the millets that today are known to be the nutri-cereals and far greater in terms of their health value for us. And we are eating a lot more of these ultra-processed items and in a lot more quantity. Especially the poor households in our country are now eating biscuit and Coke. Coke is cheaper than safe drinking water in many parts of rural India, unfortunately. And it's a reflection of the kind of warped value systems that we have, the way we have attributed value. Coca-Cola can extract our groundwater literally for free, bottle it up and sell it to us full of sugar and destroy our health. And clean drinking water is actually not available to large parts of rural India today, and even urban India.
Thank you, Richa. Very depressing, I must say, what we're hearing, but also the reality, I'm sure. The next question is by Anisa Bhutia. So the question is, thank you for the wonderful talk. Lately, I have been thinking on this topic in similar lines. My question is, would you consider heart bazaars, open-air markets, mostly found in rural areas, resisting standardization in some way?
So that's again another very interesting question, because on the one hand, yes, in terms of fruits, vegetables, or local produce. On the other hand, however, so you would have individual sellers who have come with their little tokery of stuff. So the quantity that is sold or purchased is fairly less, which is why there are chances of more diversity that is being made available. However, on the other hand, these markets have seen over time a great deal of adulteration of products, and that is one of the driving forces behind this notion of standardization. So when you buy, for example, spices, in the past, long past, people would not buy ground spices, pisawa. They would buy the whole stuff, and then you would actually ground things at home just before cooking, you would take your mix of spices and you would ground it and then you would consume it. Now, across rural India also, you find people purchasing already powdered haldi or red chili powder or a whole host of other things. And there is unfortunately a great deal of adulteration in many of these products that are being made available. And so that has been a concern. For example, the Food Safety Standards Authority of India. And this comes from the Codex Alimentaris of the Food and Agriculture Organization. These are all standards of quality that are being propagated to prevent adulteration of food. Yet these processes of standardization sort of in the name of preventing adulteration have basically flowed into the hands of corporate entities which are able to provide standardized things at a certain scale. But those very processes of quality making, standardization, and scale are the ones that are destroying the diversity in the long run because of the processes embedded in it. You can't have scale without some kind of standardization.
Thank you. We'll take about 2 more questions. The next question again is from Sheetal. She says, health and nutrition is also about characterizing food as easy intervention to social and personal well-being. So it looks like we need to take the route of integrated socio-ecological embeddedness.
That's right. That's absolutely right. That ultimately this is really about fundamentally, and this is something that a farmer told me. And if you guys are actually interested, there's this interview that I have that's been published with this farmer. It's a conversation between me and this farmer, and it's sort of it's certainly about farming, but it's really about the meaning of life itself and our purpose here on the planet. So he told me, and he's an elderly gentleman. He had a science degree from Delhi University in the 1970s. And then there were certain conditions in at the farm, in the home, which made him go back to the land and made him become a farmer again. I mean, his parents, of course, were agriculturalists, and he went back to the land. And so he says that, what is important for us to understand is that why is it that we are doing what we are doing? Why is it that I am a farmer? And that is a question that cannot be answered by science or by our modern systems of understanding the world. That is a question about meaning. What gives meaning to my life? And his answer is that he gets meaning in his life through, one, a connection with nature in terms of working with nature and understanding nature and producing things from the farm. And 2, he gets meaning in his life by connecting with people around him in working this, longer. So he doesn't call it a supply chain. He says this is so a supply chain is from a farmer to a consumer. He says it's from a farmer to a user, or from a farmer to somebody who's also participating in, he says if we eat, then we are participating in the activity of agriculture. And so for him, that relationship with people to whom he can supply healthy, nutritious food is equally important as growing that food. And so he says, when I have a relationship with the people to whom I am, of course, selling this food, they have reposed a certain trust in me that the food I give them will be healthy, will be good, will do good for them. And I then have reposed a trust in them that they will give me returns that will allow me to continue to produce good, healthy food from my farm. So which again goes back to the question of value. That it's not only about valuing nature in a particular way, it's also valuing the well-being of our farming community, such that as consumers, we are not constantly demanding the cheapest kind of food available. As consumers, we are willing to include the externalities in the price of our food and willing to pay for all those externalities so that the farmer can reproduce herself as a social entity and reproduce the farm as an ecological entity so that farming can continue to happen in the future and we can continue to get safe, healthy, nutritious food. So yes, it's absolutely about this integrated understanding about revaluing nature, but also revaluing people in very important ways.
Thanks, Richa. And it really also talks to the idea of the ethics of care that you mentioned a little bit. How do you expand that, the value system that you hold and not just value yourself and what you can draw out of nature? So very interesting. So there's one last question we'll take before we conclude. And this question is from Neha Rastogi. Thank you, Neha. Along with us as consumers, shouldn't dietitians or people who advise food type during medical conditions also be responsible to understand standardization and externality they rely upon? For instance, like quinoa is being hyped upon more in recent times, although it is not a local food. So, what is the responsibility of, say, professionals like nutritionists, dietitians, and the medical community for the health implications of this?
So again, very, very important question. I'll begin just simply by talking about the example of quinoa. So quinoa, I think if I remember correctly, it's Peru or one of the northern, one of the northernmost countries in South America, or Ecuador. I think maybe it's Ecuador, not Peru. And quinoa was like our millets. So it was grown by people for their own consumption. And in the 1980s or so, it slowly started becoming the superfood in the United States. And in the 1990s and 2000s, what people actually saw was that nobody in Ecuador was eating quinoa anymore because it was so valuable as a commodity. It was all going to the United States. And so the creation of that particular supply chain, on the one hand, it was justified in the name of, more healthy, nutritious food for a certain kind of elite consumer in the United States. But that elite consumer was also consuming food that had put up a lot of food miles, that was transported from so far away, that was creating a whole host of climate emissions. But also, it was a food that had now been snatched away from the plates of the poorest Ecuadorian farmers who were growing it in the past. And they began to rely on imported wheat and potato, which have far less nutritive value compared to quinoa in terms of their own diets and for their own children. So one needs to understand these, one needs to understand our food in its ecological as well as its social context. So it's not simply enough to like Pratigna said, this ethics of care has to be extended to understand a comprehensive, life cycle story or a holistic way of understanding what is it that is on our plate or on our thali. And in that sense, what is the responsibility of medical professionals? A great deal. And I would in fact say that, the public health community, the medical nutrition medical community has been fantastic in standing up to corporate interests. In the case of the biscuits, or in the case of, something even more egregious, which is formula milk. So that dibbe ka doodh, that has been a battle that has been fought by the public health community fairly successfully, where at one point of time, and possibly in many places even now, women in slum households, for example, would save up so that they can give their child that dibbe ka doodh, because that's supposed to be, the good mother. It was an aspirational form of consumption, and not provide breast milk, which is absolutely essential for immunity. And a lot of this was driven by corporations, their profitability, their relationships with doctors and medical professionals. Yet many others in those fields rose up, and now things have really changed on that front. So I think there is clearly a very important role for medical professionals, but it also requires a bit more jumping the gun in terms of looking at these interconnections that exist. And it also requires going beyond what one may consider their own specialization of work. And that may be somewhat challenging because the medical field has moved far greater towards specialization than towards actually looking holistically, not only at disease and the body, but also at the healing solutions that exist around that, around disease. I mean, this is a completely different conversation, but I'm happy to also take it offline.
Thank you so much, Richa. I think we've come to the end of all the questions and also the time we've had for this conversation. I want to thank you very much for this insightful talk that you gave us. A lot of food for thought, I must say. And yeah, I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. And yeah, we would conclude now. Thank you so much. Tanvi, are there any last housekeeping?
No, just thank you to Richa for such an interesting discussion and conversation. And thanks, Pratigna, for facilitating this. Thank you to everybody who joined us here on Zoom and watched us on Facebook. And we had some really interesting questions also come up. A recording of this talk will be available on our YouTube channel soon. And please follow us on our social media channels for updates on future events. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you.